Today on the Pathogen Diaries. The plague. What is the plague? How can you get the plague? How can it be contained? All of these questions you are dying to ask will be answered today on the Pathogen Diaries. The first segment today will focus on defining the plague and its history. First, let's take a look at some major outbreaks. There are 3 major pandemics that have occurred throughout history: the Justinian Plague, the Great Plague, and the Modern Plague. The Justinian Plague began in 542 AD, followed by many small outbreaks for the next 200 years that ended up killing a total of 25 million people. This plague affected basically the entire world at that time, which is now known as the Greater Mediterranean region. The second major pandemic was the Great Plague, which is better known as the Black Death. This plague originated in China in 1334 and spread along trade routes to Europe, where it continued to kill 60% of the population. The third pandemic is known as the Modern Plague, which also began in China in the 1860s and began to reach major cities by the 1890s. Once it reached Hong Kong, the plague spread to other nations by infected rats that were transported on steamships. This plague killed 10 million people in total. Now that we have a better understanding of the history of the plague, let's take a look at how the plague is spread. The first method of transmission is through flea bites. Many small rodents are infected with the plague and die from it, which leads to fleas drinking their infected blood. Another mode of infection is through the exposure to contaminated fluid or tissue. Humans can become infected by handling or coming in contact with tissues and body fluids of infected individuals. A common example of this is with hunters who skin infected animals without taking proper precautions. Bacteria in the air is another way to catch the plague. If someone who is infected coughs bacteria into the air and another breathes in this air, they could become infected. This only occurs when in close contact with other individuals and is the only way for humans to infect other humans. Due to the amount of fear the plague evokes, there are many common misconceptions related to it that we would like to clear up. During the Black Plague, the stories of the plague were dramatized by upper-class citizens. They told stories that the plague was the beginning of the end of the human race. They thought that the Black Plague was God's way of demonstrating his wrath upon the medieval ages before the Renaissance. Many of the people who lived during the Black Plague were very religious and made up false stories about the plague because they thought that God was punishing the human race for their sins. Another misconception was that the plague had come from Jews poisoning the water. Another stated that the plague was passed through corrupt vapors in the wind. Some even said the sinister conjunction of the planets Saturn, Jupiter, and Mars caused it. One final misconception was that the plague was passed on through lust with old women. So now that we know some background information on the plague, we can move on to how it affects the body and the immune system response. The plague is caused by a bacteria called Yersinia pestis, or Y. pestis, that is highly infectious. This means that the bacteria is often able to easily avoid and suppress immune system response. When the host is bitten by a flea, the skin tears, which breaks down the primary defense against the bacteria. This provides easy access for Y. pestis to enter the body. Y. pestis is able to easily suppress immune system responses because of its unique properties. One of the first immune system responses is the release of leukocytes that aid in phagocytosis. Phagocytosis is the process that allows the immune system to ingest the bacteria and break it down. Y. pestis has specific antigens that are anti-phagocytic, so they are able to resist this process. As Y. pestis bacteria resist phagocytosis, they inject YOPS, or Yersinia outer proteins, into the cells of the immune system. This allows them to survive in the body and multiply. Y. pestis is then able to spread very quickly throughout the bloodstream and infect large organs such as the liver, kidneys, and spleen. Eventually, the bacteria infects the lymph nodes, which then begin to swell, become tender and hot, and bleed heavily. As the infection spreads, the victim develops severe bacterial pneumonia, and death is the result of the endotoxic shock. There are many forms of Y. pestis that change depending on how the individual is infected. If the bacteria is spread through cough droplets in the air, their lungs become affected, leading to rapid mortality, pneumonic plague. If the individual is bitten by a flea, their lymph nodes become infected and they have the bubonic plague. Eventually, the bacteria is spread through the blood to the lungs and the individual ends up with pneumonic plague. Although once infected, the plague usually results in death. There are vaccinations and treatments available. The vaccination is derived from artificially grown Y. pestis bacteria and is administered in a set of 3 injections. Those who may already be affected or are at a high risk of infection are treated with heavy antibiotics within 24 hours. Luckily for us, there are ways to break the cycle of the plague. In this next section, we will look at containment plans for the plague. Breaking the epidemiological triangle is vital in the containment of the plague. There are 3 factors in the epidemiological triangle: the environment, the host, and the agent. In the case of the plague, the agent is the cause of the disease, Y. pestis, the host is the organism infected, humans, and the environment is the surrounding conditions that lead to the infection, such as broken skin by a flea bite or bacteria in the air from coughing. In order to break this triangle, the connection between factors must be broken, so in order to stop the plague from spreading, there must be specific action taken for containment so the epidemiological triangle can be broken. There are many steps in the plan of action for containing the plague. One of the first steps is taking preventative measures to control the initial spread of the plague. This includes educating the public, controlling rats on shipping docks and ships, wearing gloves when handling wildlife, and active immunization and vaccination of the population. The next step would be to control contact with the infected patients and the environment around them. This includes isolation, disinfection, quarantine, investigating sources of infection, and treating patients with specialized medication. The treatment for patients is the drug streptomycin, which is usually very successful if administered within 8 to 18 hours of symptoms. After taking those measures, the next step would be epidemic control. This would include increased investigation of the source of the virus, implementing extreme rodent and flea control, and heavily protecting those working in especially at-risk environments. There would also be international measures taken to prevent the plague from spreading across the world. Due to the fact that previous pandemics occurred years before modern medicine was readily available, these containment plans are more modern. Back then, the only real way to avoid getting the plague was to avoid contact with those who were infected. Many cities did not allow visitors, such as merchants or minorities, to enter the city, and guards had to go through sanitary measures at their post. Quarantine was also introduced during the Great Plague in small hospitals, but there was very little treatment for those patients. Although there has not been a major pandemic in years, many scientists and historians have evidence that the plague is not dead. Professors at Smith College pointed out that the plague is not just a thing of the past, it is still very much present in the world. Today, the plague lives in parts of Africa, and after small breakouts in the 1990s, it has been classified as a re-emerging disease. Over the last 20 years, there have been 1,000 to 5,000 human cases of the plague, and 100 to 200 deaths reported to the World Health Organization each year. Over the years, there has been a major shift in cases from Asia to Africa, with more than 90% of all cases and deaths in the last 5 years occurring in Madagascar, Tanzania, Mozambique, Malawi, Uganda, and the Democratic Republic of the Congo. Today, one of the greatest fears with the plague is its potential as a biological weapon. Professors believe that the plague should not be dismissed as a potential threat, but so far nobody has figured out how to make a weapon of the Y. pestis that is efficient. Although many classify the plague as a thing of the past, scientists still believe that it remains too poorly understood to overlook and is something we cannot afford to ignore. Well, that's all we have for you today. We hope you enjoyed learning about the plague, and we'll see you next time on the Pathogen Diaries.
Around the roses, pocket full of